landing of an exploratory expedition into Africa was a direct result of two resolutions of the Synodical Convention of 1947, that the Synod authorized the expansion of our mission work in foreign heathen fields, and that the General Mission Board be instructed to continue its investigation and explore the most promising heathen fields and report to the General Committee for further instructions. To carry out these resolutions, the Mission Board decided to send out a two-man exploratory team to make an on-the-spot investigation of the most promising fields in Africa. Over a year went by before two men were found to carry out this assignment. This was in December of 1948. By April of 1949, only 3 months later, these men would have to be underway to time their journey just right to avoid the rainy seasons which occur at different times in even adjacent areas of Africa and make travel in the bush country extremely dangerous or even impossible. This meant 3 months of feverish preparations. With only a meager knowledge of what to expect, we had to decide on a tentative route of travel. Upon the advice of experienced men, we purchased a powerful truck with complete living quarters and stocked it with food, medicines, and supplies for 5 months. Passports and visas for the 14 countries of our probable line of travel had to be secured. Shots had to be taken against tropical diseases. A staggering list of other important items, such as clothes, insecticides, firearms, had to be laid in. The home congregations and the families had to be provided for. Finally, we were ready and took off by truck for New York, from where we held passage on the African Crescent, a freighter of the Faro Line, bound for Cape Town, 7,000 miles away on the southern tip of Africa. We weighed anchor at night and passed through the blinking lights of New York Harbor. The 20 days aboard the African Crescent were days of welcome rest and relaxation. On both Sundays at sea, we were invited to conduct church services for the passengers and crew. Time seemed to hang on our hands. All at once, there was nothing to do but to eat and sleep, to read. Finally came the day when Mr. Trunin announced that we were to sight Cape Town the next morning. After 20 days of confinement and restricted activity at sea, we looked forward to placing our feet again on terra firma, even though it meant going through the first experience with the red tape of customs and immigration examinations. There lay Cape Town at the very tip of Africa on the Cape of Good Hope, still under the mist of the tablecloth of clouds draping Table Mountain. We were not allowed to dock, but had to stand out to sea until we had clearance from the customs, immigration, and quarantine officers who came aboard from their lighters. Here's the customs officer with his severed Van Dyke beard and a stern mien coming on board by means of the Jacob's ladder. The 4 flags at our mast show that the pilot, the customs, immigration, and quarantine officers are on board, questioning the passengers and examining their papers and effects. It took us a full 4 days to clear through customs because without our knowledge, much of our long list of goods had become contraband through a month-old regulation of the new government of the Union of South Africa, which is trying to keep out American imports. While the arguing and examining is going on, let us take a look at the map of South Africa and the route of our 7,000-mile safari. We begin at Cape Town. Windhoek, Angola, east to the Belgian Congo, down into northern Rhodesia to the country of the Hook of the Kafui, Victoria Falls and into southern Rhodesia, toward Mozambique and the Indian Ocean into the Union of South Africa, Pretoria, Johannesburg, and home. To gain a proper picture of the tremendous size of this area, let us superimpose it on the map of North America, both drawn to the same scale. We see that it stretches from the Isthmus of Panama to the border of Canada and from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic states. Our trip would run from Mexico City to the Canadian Rockies, then to the Great Lakes and south to the extreme tip of Texas. Finally, we were permitted to pay a high duty on our goods, and our truck was released. Cape Town has many beautiful subtropical suburbs with Table Mountain as a backdrop. Much as we wanted to linger, we could not afford to, because the Royal Auto Club at Cape Town had warned us of bad roads for which they could not furnish even a road map, so we had to be on our way. Africa, only a few miles inland from the oceans, is a vast plateau, sending its silt-laden rivers rushing down to the sea. When one travels parallel to the sea as we did, the trip is a continual nightmare of ups and downs and of abrupt washouts and dry washes. For the first 50 miles, good road leads through the fertile Cape province. Then the road becomes steadily worse until finally it is easier to drive over the open veldt than to follow the trail. The glaring winter sun was constantly in our eyes to the north. The scenery reminds one of Arizona, even to the Arizona nightingale grazing among the rocks. Minor motor trouble began to develop from the terrible wrenching and bumping of our truck. At first we were able to cope with it, but after 5.5 days of this, our brakes were almost gone, 2 spring blades were broken, and the shocks were out of commission. Our gross weight was 5 tons on a 1-ton chassis. Seldom could we now afford the time to prepare a hot lunch at noon, because our late start and slow progress put us way behind schedule. Dried dates and chocolate bars, dried prunes and canned fruit juices were great time savers. The road continued bad and finally ended at Goodhouse with a sign facing the desert, "Knee pass knee," no passage. But we drove into the citrus grove and tried to negotiate with the owner about crossing over the Orange River on his pont or ferry. He spoke only Afrikaans, African Dutch, but his native boy, Petrus, could speak German. We asked him about the crossing, and he looked at our top-heavy vehicle, shook his head and said, "Nein, kippt über." No, it will tip over. He told us it would be 400 miles to the east, where we could make a safe crossing. So we dickered with him until finally he agreed to try the crossing on 2 conditions. One condition was that we would unload the truck completely. 2, that we would pay them to dig a new channel and a landing stage on the other bank to get near enough to land. We agreed. So with 7 boys, Petrus rowed across and started digging at 10 in the morning. When the boys slowed down after lunch because of the hot sun, we sent them some jackknives. Again they slowed down, so we sent over some mouth organs. That was a tactical error. They stopped altogether. Even the dogs became tired of watching. We were worried. We even had visions of our expedition at the bottom of the Orange River. At 4:30 in the afternoon, 6.5 hours after they had begun, the boys rowed back. The sun was already setting. A brisk breeze had sprung up to add to our anxiety. The other bank looked high and foreboding. The ticklish moment arrives for us to place the big truck on the little pond, down the steep bank. Petrus stands by with uplifted hand to call the whole thing off if his kippt über proves to be true. Nothing happens, and the truck is on the ferry. The cable is useless because of the new channel, so it is passed over the truck and the boys take to their long poles and push us across. Even with the breeze and the boy on our top raising our center of gravity, our craft rode on an even keel. It had been loaded perfectly. It took another lazy half hour to make the crossing. Other crossings were made after this one on faster streams and shakier ferries, but this was our first experience, and we felt a great relief when we finally neared the North Shore. The full power of our four-wheel drive in creeper gear was necessary to pull through the sand, but finally our house on wheels had made a safe beachhead on the barren soil of southwest Africa, the former German colony of Deutsch Westafrika during the days before the First World War. Now the equipment, the food supplies and baggage had to be carried down to the stage and placed aboard the pont for the second crossing. It was twilight and evening was coming fast. After a hard day's work, our native boys were still cheerful as they lugged the heavy equipment to the pont. We paid their boss about $16 for 9 men and the pont for the day. This was much more than they had demanded. It was fortunate for us that we overpaid them, because we got hopelessly stuck in the heavy sand on the other side, and when they heard our gears grinding, they came over in the dark and helped us to get out. The road became extremely rough. Where the last rains had washed out long sections, the truck would suddenly drop 12 to 15 inches into a dry wash, jarring us so hard that the shelves tore off the wall and our food and supplies were spilled in the aisle. We were now on the last stretch at Rehoboth, 50 miles from Windhoek, the capital. The natives often ran from our camera out of superstitious fear. Here's a man who conquered the Southwest African roads with a vehicle which combined the ancient with the modern, the touch of the true artist. Finally, with one cylinder out and the truck listing to one side, we wheezed uphill and coasted down to save our motor. And so we arrived at Windhoek. Our friends from the ship, the Kurt Stearns, live here and had been out on the road looking for us, and they gave us a hearty welcome. After a hot bath, a shave, clean clothes, and a good meal, our spirits lifted considerably. It was Saturday evening, too late to get our truck into the German garage. On Sunday, we planned to attend the Lutheran church, situated so beautifully on the hill with the government buildings. But the church was closed. Because of its insistence on the German language even today, the Lutheran church in Southwest Africa is in a deplorable condition. No work is being done among the English and Afrikaans-speaking people in the territory. Most of the pastors were interned as enemy aliens during the Second World War. As Mr. Stern had told us, these churches need help, but they must make that help possible. The home of the Kurt Stearns, our personal letter of introduction to the Southwest African administrator, did us little good because of party politics, and only the kindness and influence of these good people opened doors of information and contact for us in Southwest Africa. 3 European languages are used at Windhoek: Afrikaans, English, and German, plus many native dialects. Each group lives largely for itself, and American immigration and imports are being discouraged. The apartheid, or separatist policy, which prevails in South Africa since the election of the Malan Party, showed its bad effects also here at Windhoek, where the natives live in locations or slums under filthy disease and crime breeding conditions. Windhoek has 9,000 white people but over 30,000 Africans are blacks. And very little is being done to help them because of the resulting tax burden and the fear that improved conditions would merely attract still more natives and aggravate the original problem. One medical man, Dr. Kiwi of the city, spends a half a day each week among the natives at his own expense, but obviously he cannot begin to cope with the disease and contagion which are bred in these shacks made of boards, old tin cans, and even cardboard. This girl is on her way to the native Lutheran Church of the Rheinische Mission. This mission has worked in Southwest Africa for over 50 years. Although support from Germany has been cut off since the First World War, the work has progressed under the fine, self-sacrificing spirit of the missionaries, and over 85,000 are counted today as the baptized membership. The native Lutheran congregation of Pastor Werner of the Rheinische Mission on Pentecost Sunday, the occasion of a great song festival by the different choirs of his large congregation of over 11,000 souls. You now hear the recording we made. The singing is accompanied by a brass band. The faces of the children show the many different types of natives served by the Rheinische Mission. Namas, Hereros, Kaffirs, those with the light skin and the oriental features, who were the traders among the tribes, the Ovambos, Okavangos, Hottentots, Zulus, and others. They are a happy and easygoing lot, a fact which is important as a reason for the peace in South Africa today, despite native exploitation, and has prevented a horrible racial outbreak. The children made up this little game after observing the very funny way in which white people greet one another when they meet. When our truck and bodies had been restored again, we took leave of our friends and the city of Windhoek just as the sun was setting from one of the old German castles up in the suburban hills. These castles were built in the days of the German occupation. Upon the advice of our friends of the Rheinische Mission, we stopped at Okahandja, a little town north of Windhoek, to visit the venerable veteran of the Lutheran missions in Southwest Africa, Dr. Heinrich Vedder. He has been active in the work for almost 50 years and has become a recognized authority on native languages and customs. In his retirement, he is now working 12 to 15 hours a day, writing books and manuals for his younger co-workers. His heart is heavy with anxiety for the work of the Rheinische Mission. He wondered how long his younger co-workers could get along on the equivalent of $60 to $70 a month, which is all that can be paid to them without help from overseas. When he learned that we were looking for a field for our church, he pointed to several virgin territories, such as the area west of the Kalahari Desert in Bechuanaland and the Kaoko Veld in the extreme northwestern corner of Southwest Africa, and leaving Dr. Vedder, Okahandja, and civilization behind us, we lumbered off over the open veldt under the glaring sun to Otjiwarongo and Ucho, police outposts, riding up on our shooting deck. We were headed for the Etosha Pan, an immense dry lake bed about 70 miles long, where wild game abounds. On the southern rim of the sandy waste of the Etosha Pan stands Fort Namutoni, a Bow-Guest relic of the German occupation, where the desert garrison had built a swimming pool at a spring. Here we bathed under the palm trees and oleanders. We were not to enjoy a real bath again until 2.5 weeks later at the Rutland Hotel at Ndola in northern Rhodesia. Pete Butcher, as Shell Oil representative, was going our way, and we were very happy to have him with us, since he knew this wild area and we had been unable to get a map of it. Here is the gleaming white sand of the Etosha Pan, and beyond it, the land of the Ovambos, protected from the tourist by government regulation. The nest of the community bird, built and shared by the whole colony. The first line, the footprint of a large wild beast, plainly outlined in the sand. Another sure sign, all that was left of a recent lion kill, the bones and hide of a large wildebeest. Wildlife in great herds appeared on all sides, roan antelope. Without leaving the trail, we were able to shoot this herd of giraffe grazing on the veldt. One of them could not curb his curiosity and came right up to our truck. A little herd of buckies or springbok came within range. They are very swift runners. A large group of wildebeest or gnu grazing near a palm grove. A band of zebra in almost military formation. At a palm-shaded waterhole, we came upon another kill, a zebra devoured by lion and picked clean by jackals and buzzards. While we were focusing on some giraffe in the distance, a slight movement behind us in a nearby bush caught our eye. There crouched a lion, watching us. Swinging the camera toward him, we got his portrait, but he finally sulked off. On the other side, another lion tried to scare us with his coughing and snarling, but he thought better of attacking. The big white monster on the trail was too much to handle for even the king of the beasts. They both slunk off with an occasional evil look and a throaty growl and joined the other lions of the pride or family of 7 full-grown brutes. We tried to chase them out of the wooded copse to which they had retreated by throwing stones, but they refused to come out. We carried firearms only for emergency use, and so were without hunting licenses, and our guns had been carefully sealed by the border police. Several nights later, we had to break the seals when we camped in wild elephant country in Angola. Pete Betcher is sitting in the left foreground as we eat our noon luncheon of schinken from Windhoek, pumpernickel from Cincinnati, and pineapple from Hawaii. The plastic-covered paper plates were not only practical, but more sanitary than dishes washed with water of uncertain origin. All water had to be boiled 15 minutes. While we were sitting here, several bushmen approached our truck, armed with bows and poisoned arrows. When we gave them salt and tobacco, They became friendly, and before long they even parted with some of their weapons. Their primitive chants and the songs which they learned from the boys who brought them back from the mines are what you now hear from our recordings. One of the young bushmen shooting with a slingshot down at the water hole. During the rest of the day, the bushmen came and went, a few at a time, men, women, and children, to look us over and to receive gifts from us. Imagine our surprise when during their chanting we suddenly heard them sing Luther's battle hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," which they must have learned from some boy returning from the mines or missions. Here we had come all these miles into this most primitive territory looking for mission openings, and these bushmen already knew our hymns. We felt that we had taken this first timid step into foreign fields rather late. Through a native named Asaf, we got them to promise to return the next day, and we could not get rid of them until we left. They were fascinated by everything, but especially by our tape recorder, which held them spellbound when they heard their own voices come out of our magic brown box. The men danced the ceremonial routine of a wedding chant, while the women beat the time with their hands. The boys are learning the steps. It seems that kids just cannot win when it comes to getting dirty. Where skins are white, the dirt is black. And in Africa, where skins are black, the dirt is white, and shows just as much. Pipes are scarce and tobacco scarcer, so the pipe is passed around. It was offered to us also, but we declined politely but firmly. With much fuss and circumstance, precious water is dipped from an open water hole. We made the black boy Asa boil and sterilize the water for our dishes. Then he took water out of this hole to cool it off for his hands. From then on, we did our own dishes and got along very well without a black boy. Mother and child. The sun hurts their eyes also, and they suffer greatly from a variety of diseases of the eye, like the horrible Loa Loa worm in the cornea and trichinosis. Without any map to guide us, we headed north into the sun to go to Abambo land. The first 30 miles were hot but fairly easy on the Etosha Pan, but the last 100 miles were torture for the truck and torment for us. Because of the heavy sand, we finally left the trail completely and ground on through the brush, many a mile in creeper gear, four-wheel drive. We reached the government post on Dangwa, exhausted. Our average speed had been 8.5 miles an hour that day. Administrator Wessel wanted us to go on a hunt for the lion, which had killed a native that day, but we could not afford the time, and we were much too tired. Mr. Rootman, Commissioner of Education, took us instead on a visit to the Finnish Lutheran missions in Ovamboland and some native kraals which we could never have entered without him. Like the Bushmen, the boys of the Ovambo tribe work in the copper, tin, and zinc mines to the south. These boys are waiting for a physical checkup before they are allowed to leave on the journey of hundreds of miles to the mines. After 7 months in the mines, they are paid off in scrip, which they spend on all sorts of cast-off junk to lug back to their home kraal, and many come back with TB. The Ovambos are one of the proudest tribes of Africa. They raise cattle not for milk or meat, but as a mark of their prosperity. Introduced by Mr. Rootman, we were welcomed into several primitive kraals, or family compounds, occupied by the entire clan. The headman usually has several wives. One of the sons had brought an army coat back from the mines and wore it all day, although it was very hot, and made sure that he got into every picture. The noise of the heavy pestle and chant of the corn stompers are what you hear from our recording. It was harvest time in Ovamboland, and the Kaffir corn is being threshed out. Led by the headman of the tribe, the family gives us a big-hearted hand of welcome. The women occupy separate sleeping quarters with doors that are so low that one must crawl into them. Kaffir corn is an important part of their diet. The young women of the tribe work for days and days, threshing it out with crude, primitive stompers, and then grinding it in clay mortars with wooden pestles. While they stomp, they sing, keeping up a steady rhythm. It was the end of a hot day, but they were still full of life and fun. The cornmeal is mixed with grass and water and then baked in cakes by the sun. Most white children are raised by native nurse boys, even though these go back to their family kraals for the night and return in the morning, exposing the child to all the vermin and disease of the kraal, plus the superstitions and all the native gibberish. The practice continues because help is so cheap, and the mother is thus relieved of much work and responsibility. Straight across the plains we drove from here to Ononjokwe, the hospital station of the Finnish Lutheran Church. Dr. Annie Melander is in charge. She and her staff returned to their native Finland to help against the Russians 10 years ago, but they all came back to Ovamboland after the war. She and several others in a sailing vessel which took them 7 months because their country was so impoverished. Dr. Melander often sees 90 and more patients a day for a total caseload of 12,000 a year. The Ovambo choir sang a selection of hymns for our recording. The hut system is used at Ananjokwe to guard against contagion and to cope with the fact that when one member of the family is hospitalized, the whole family often come to stay. Lion casualties like this one are not rare. On the day of our visit, another one was brought in for Dr. Melander's surgery. Warmly loved and esteemed, she reminded us of Dr. Schweitzer at Lamborghini in her self-denying labor among these native children of the African veldt. Dr. Melander had removed a loa loa worm from this old man's eye. She and her staff of 5 Finnish Lutheran nurses are performing a Herculean task, unpublicized by press and radio, in an almost unknown corner of Africa. Approaching Engela, another Finnish station, these native girls are carrying baskets full of dung on their heads to be used for fuel. As we entered the office, we witnessed a sight too solemn to be photographed. An Ovambo mother had brought her dying baby from her distant kraal so that it might die and go to heaven in the arms of the Finnish nurse. Reverend Jalmari Hopizalmi, the director of Engela, has established beside the hospital also a boys and girls boarding school to develop Christian evangelists and laymen and to teach useful arts and crafts. The Finns are very careful not to alter the native living patterns any more than necessary, and in this they are greatly helped by the government's ban on tourists in this area. The Kaffir corn is ground and prepared here, just as it has been and will be again in the home kraal when the girls have finished their course at the boarding school. Reverend Huppy Zalmi with his dog. He was very kind to us, even heating the bath hut and treating us to a Finnish sauna, a Finnish bath before we went to bed. It was after hours, but the boys were very glad to show us the work which they had learned at the boarding school. Just at sunset, Reverend Huppy Zalmi assembled the young people for chapel. He explained our mission to them and asked them to join him in a prayer for our safety and for the happy outcome of our expedition. Hundreds of miles to the south, loaded down with all kinds of clothes, headgear, and assorted cast-off junk. At the last stop before we entered Portuguese West Africa, or Angola, we struck a gas station which boasted a gas pump. Crossing the Cunene River, we find ourselves in a beautiful new land, Angola, the crown colony and source of great revenue for Portugal. Even at the border post, Villa Pereira d'Eta, it is evident that this land is much more developed than Southwest Africa. Our Portuguese was limited to what we could find in our manual of foreign words and phrases, but we managed to pass and pay the customs officer and to exchange our South African pounds for a big fistful of relatively worthless angolaras. Engrossed in foreign words and phrases, we did not notice that we had picked up a passenger at the village where we had bought some high-priced petrol, which was now constantly clogging our gas line. But 50 miles further on, we found him standing on our rear bumper. We were unable to find out why this blind woman who was being led by another one carried on as she did. Fire broke out in our truck twice not far from here because of short circuit. We put it out with our extinguishers, but part of our wiring was gone, plus the cutout. With no lights, and because of our slow progress, we had to park in wild elephant country for 2 nights, and our revolvers were next to our pillows. The nearest town was 200 miles away. We heard of an American mission only 70 miles off our road, so we headed for it. But before long, we broke down again, this time only a half mile from the temporary straw home of a family of South African voortrekkers headed north. With our meager knowledge of Afrikaans and the slight knowledge of English and mechanics of one of their sons, we wired around our trouble, and this later cost us a new generator. The 70-mile detour to the American mission Galang brought us no help either. Arrived at that place, we met a Negro at the entrance and asked him to direct us to Sam Coles, the head of the mission. With a soft southern accent, he said, "I'm Sam Coles. What could I do for you?" He admitted he knew little about motors, but he became intensely interested in our quest for a mission field. He described a field of 70,000 square miles with a population of over 200,000 in the elephant country through which we had just passed, entirely untouched by Christian missions. We verified this later at Nova Lisboa, the seat of government. Mr. Coles learned blacksmithing, wagon making, and tile making in Mississippi, and is now teaching his African friends, as he calls them, these useful arts for the support of his mission, just while he teaches them the gospel. The roof tiles which are being made here will be sold in the cities and towns for about 3 cents apiece. Mr. Coles was careful to explain to us that while he worked with them, he did not neglect the real purpose of his coming to Africa from his native Mississippi. He said, "Our Lord worked in a carpenter shop, and I work with my boys in the tile and wagon shop. And while we work, we sing, and I tell them all about the Lord and about their soul's salvation. This way I get closer to them." Leaving Galang, we made a wrong turn which cost us an extra 85 miles. At Nova Lisboa, we got a new generator for 3,500 angolaras, about $90 in our money, and finally turned east toward the Belgian Congo. We tried in vain to make this curious crowd understand what we needed. Then we asked whether anyone could speak English. At once several of them cried out, "Jose Lazaro, Jose Lazaro." They took us to his house just opposite the village church, and our worries were over. He spoke English, took us in, got our truck repaired, and assured us that he would help us get established if we ever were interested in the Cunene Kabangu field, where lived many of the 30,000 natives who harvested castor beans for his firm. Senor Jose Lazaro is the gentleman with the coat on the right. The other is his good friend Enrique Martins from Villa General Machado. Only 10 degrees south of the equator, the days were much hotter and very humid, and the vegetation became much more lush. Our road ran almost parallel to the narrow gauge railroad running from the Atlantic port of Lobito to Elizabethville in the Belgian Congo, a distance of 2,000 miles and more. This part of Angola has many fine woods like mahogany, mosivi, and lusango. We stopped at the lumber mill of Vaz and Irma to buy a piece of Angola teak. Our conversation was somewhat stilted because of our constant reference to our foreign words and phrases, but we got our board, dressed by hand, plus a second breakfast, and finally left with what we understood to be the best wishes of Mr. and Mrs. Vaz. Bearing north to about 8 degrees, we came upon several banana plantations with their curious fruit clusters, and the still more curious and dangerous habit the banana boys have of carrying their razor-sharp banana knives in their belts. Soon after we had cleared customs at Gilolo, exchanging our money from Angolaras to Belgian francs, and from Portuguese to the French pages in our foreign words and phrases, we arrived at the Lulua River, a tributary of the mighty Congo. We were actually thankful for this ferry crossing because the rickety bridges of Angola had almost broken under our weight. It's quite a feat to balance in one of these Congo dugouts, to say nothing of standing in them with two others and trying to fish with a heavy net. According to the World Mission Almanac, the Belgian Congo is said to be well supplied with Christian missions, so we hurried through this area. The roads everywhere are topped with crushed ant hills, carried out of the jungle by the women and then pounded flat by the men, becoming almost as hard as asphalt. At Jadoville, we learned that we were in the heart of the uranium mines, which are the chief source of supply for our American industry. We had our truck repaired. This time it was a broken rim, and observed the people coming and going in their colorful clothing, carrying a variety of things on their heads. Between Jadoville and Elizabethville, the ant hills were higher than anywhere else that we had seen. They are usually built by the little creatures around some convenient tree trunk, which is killed in the process. One towered high above a native, holding a spear and standing at its base. At Elizabethville, we hoped to pick up mail from home after 4 weeks without any word at all. But the city was celebrating the Independence Day of the Congo on July 1st, and all business places were closed. So we looked the city over and paid our respects to the two Protestant missionaries. They told us that although much work was being done in the rural areas, the city and mining locations were poorly served. Elizabethville has 8,000 Europeans and over 72,000 natives. but only one Protestant missionary is working at present in the native quarters. The road running south from the Congo into northern Rhodesia improved noticeably, but even a strong stretch of the imagination would hardly give credit for it to this heavy-duty road-building machine pulled across the anthill material by natives who are working off their road tax. It was so warm and cramped inside the truck, so we washed and shaved outdoors, to the great amusement of the populace, which always gathered around that odd vehicle wherever we parked. Several people at Ndola had advised us to see Reverend Gray at Broken Hill for information about mission openings in Rhodesia, since he has worked here for 50 years. Over a cup of tea, he told us that our coming at this time was a veritable godsend, since the government was opening the first of its 11 native development centers in the district of Chief Kabulwe-Bulwe, just north of the Hook of the Kafui, the same area into which he had promised a dying chief 20 years before to send some Christian missionaries. Not one of the Protestant or Catholic missions were able to send men because of the great shortage at the present time. The little daughter of our friend Mr. Serpentine of the Department of Mines. The whole bush is aflame at night from fires kindled by the natives to prevent self-ignited fires from sweeping through their villages. These villages are very clean. This one is just east of the Lukanga swamps. Only 45 miles away on the west side of the swamps, on high fertile ground, lie the districts of Chief Kabulwe-Bulwe and Kaindu, which had been pointed out to us by Reverend Gray as a very promising field. This thatched roof is being laid on a house built entirely by native labor. We found the government of northern Rhodesia very anxious to develop native talents and skills. This large program for native development is under the direction of Mr. John Moffat and is designed to open up the vast agriculture and timber resources of the territory, while at the same time it encourages the natives to return from the cities and mines to their rural villages. The preliminary building and agricultural parts of the program are already underway in the Hook of the Kafui, country of Chief Kabulwe-Bulwe. A large crop of hybrid corn was raised in this development project by natives who were working under the direction of a government farmer. It must be remembered that this first development center has 40,000 square miles, almost as large as the state of Ohio. The present population is only 105,000, but thousands of natives are migrating into the region from as far away as Angola, attracted by the development program. At Lusaka, the capital of northern Rhodesia, we called first on Padre Hewitt, the head of the Church of England and an influential man in northern Rhodesia. He confirmed our information on the Hook of the Kafui, also stating that the climate there would be similar to that of the Carolinas and northern Florida, with an average annual temperature of 70 degrees and an elevation of between 3,000 and 5,000 feet. Climatically, it is classified as tropical savanna land. On streets lined with luxuriant flowers such as bougainvillea, we drove to the business section of Lusaka. The city has been carefully planned like Washington, D.C., and surely will be one of the beautiful cities of Africa in the near future. We parked our house car and then we sauntered through the streets and shops. Strange contrasts are to be seen in this land. An ox-drawn wagon is setting out from the post office for some distant ranch, and only a few seconds later, a modern American ambulance whizzes past the camera lens. For this is new land, a pioneer land, a land of great natural wealth and promise, just awakening. Here's the shirt and pants factory of northern Rhodesia. The men do the sewing in Africa because, after all, the sewing machine is a machine, and only men can properly run machines. and the product isn't half bad either. We must run the gauntlet of these curious children, for we have an appointment to keep with Mr. John Moffat, the Commissioner for Native Development, and also an invitation to sit in on a session of the legislature to see how in northern Rhodesia, Europeans and natives sit side by side, deliberating on the country's welfare. Mr. Moffat pointed out the same field near the hook of the Kafui, indicated already by Reverend Gray, Patrick Hewitt, Mr. Bush, and Mr. Price, as the most promising for our church, assuring us that we would find no difficulty or obstacle in establishing our work there. Parked under a baobab tree that night, we thanked our God for having brought us to the goal of our quest of more than 12,000 miles and answering our prayer for a field into which our church might enter without interference or compromise. Now we could hurry home on the road south to Livingstone and the great Victoria Falls. We were still 2,000 miles north of Cape Town. July was running out rapidly, and our ship was scheduled to sail early in August. But our hearts were light. The baboons of the Zambezi jungle appeared first, indicating that we were near the Victoria Falls, where the broad Zambezi flows to the east and suddenly sends 1 solid mile of its waters crashing down over the southern bank into a deep, narrow chasm, producing falls twice as high as the Niagara Falls. The plume of mist and spray rises hundreds of feet into the air, often hiding the falls from view and making it very difficult to photograph them. Both the mist and the sun are continually getting into the camera lens. From this vantage point, one is sometimes no more than 400 feet from the plunging water. A drenching rain falls continually. In fact, this southern bank has a vegetation that is so lush that it is called the rainy forest, and the water is incessantly dripping down through the tropical growth. A short distance down this path, we were attacked by a large male baboon while we were photographing his mate and offspring. Only a quick thrust of the pointed tripod of our camera drove the animal back. The baboons have grown quite accustomed to the people who visit the falls. In fact, we found that they felt so much at home that they had literally taken over our truck when we returned from our hike. This little guy kept coming back again and again. And when danger threatened, he didn't seem to care whose back he boarded for safety and transportation. we shot them through our windshield as they tried to jump from the hood to the roof. And then they came into the cab even while we were shooting their pictures. Finally, one got away with an ear of corn, which we had brought from the hook of the Kafui. Leaving at sunset, we cleared customs and headed through southern Rhodesia toward Mozambique on the Indian Ocean. 65 miles beyond the village of Louis Tricard, we broke down with 2 flat tires at one time. One was flat because of another broken rim, and the other because of some lazy native who failed to fill our spare. Our pump refused to function, so we sat and waited. Night was coming on. The natives began crowding around, as always. Down along the border of Mozambique, we entered an area abounding in wild game. One of the many varieties of deer, the graceful impala, zebra, look closely and you will see a bird flying just in front of the giraffe. We were told that they often pick the giraffe's teeth for morsels of food. This fellow was all of 18 feet tall. Our truck was 10.5 feet high, and we stood on its roof, yet this animal's head was slightly above us. Many other animals came within easy camera range. The rare sable antelope. Waterbuck. The clumsy gnu, or wildebeest, as they are called in Afrikaans, lumbered along, while the graceful impala grazed quietly, then broke into frenzied activity, dashing back and forth out of a sheer joy of life. Suddenly, they began a mad game of tag, leaping across our trail in a mighty bound. The late Jan Christian Smut was on his way to the elephant country of Mozambique when we met him at Punda Maria. He was happy to see us again, asked us about our journey and the success of our mission, and then begged to see the interior of our living quarters. When we showed them to him, he exclaimed, "These Americans, no wonder they succeed. It's fabulous to bring the American standard of life into our African bush." Our last breakfast in the big truck was nothing special. The same old pawpaw, which tastes like fine-grained melon crossed with Calavo pear, hot instant cocoa with canned milk, pumpernickel bread and honey. We took turns at doing dishes and sweeping out. The chore girls, which we had wisely brought with us, plus good old elbow grease, were always necessary to remove the burnt food from forgotten pots and pans. This is only the sand which we shook out of our shoes, socks, and clothing after we had swept the evening before. It was very discouraging keeping house in that truck. It's only 35 miles from Pretoria to Johannesburg, the metropolis, but we were not spared another and final flat tire. By then we had established such a fluent routine that we hardly minded the labor and trouble. Approaching this largest of the African cities south of the equator, one sees first the notorious reef, the slums and native quarters of Johannesburg, featured in Patton's Cry the Beloved Country, a place where over 500,000 natives live under the shadow of the gold mine slag piles and the deeper shadow of filth, crime, and misery, a living indictment against the avarice of man and a challenge to Christian missions. And misery, the slag piles of the gold mines which honeycomb the earth beneath the city, an ugly scar on the landscape and the source of constant anxiety because of the threat of a native uprising and retaliation. Our ship was reported a month late in sailing. We tried in vain to get passage on another vessel, so we decided to fly home, and that via Europe, because the fare is the same as via South America. Our Royal Dutch airliner headed steadily north over the Union, over Bechuanaland, Rhodesia, and Angola, and landed at Leopoldville in the Congo only 7 hours after our takeoff, a trip that had taken us weeks by truck. As we flew at 18,000 feet over French equatorial Africa, with its mighty rivers looking impressive even from that great height, the title for this film drifted into our minds as one that would be most appropriate, for far below us in bush and veldt, we knew that Africa still calls. Whether that cry arose from the natives whom we had seen in the vast forests and savannas of northern Rhodesia, from the miserable people in gunny sack clothes who inhabit the reef and other mining compounds, from the bushland of the far west, from the banana groves of the Congo, from the thickets of Angola, from the land of the Lulua, from the primitive bushmen of the Kalahari in Bechuanaland, from the wretched inhabitants of the locations, or from the proud Obumbos of the Kunene and Kubango in Angola. It mattered little where they were. We felt that the cry of them rose from the earth. There was still much mission work to be done. Africa still calls. Such were our thoughts as our powerful plane crossed the equator into Nigeria, and 2 hours later came down on the edge of the Sahara at Kano, the mud city of Nigeria. Kano is the last jumping off place before one crosses the Sahara for Tunis on the Mediterranean. Here we saw how Mohammedanism has already crept south of the Sahara. Abdullah, the curio vendor of Kano, who speaks American from his days as stevedore on an American cargo boat in World War II, is a Mohammedan. A few feet from him, among the lizards, another young Mohammedan convert was washing and praying with his face toward Mecca. Muslim missionaries are zealous in luring the natives from their pagan idols and taboos into the empty cult and ritualism of Islam, making it twice as difficult to win them for the truth and freedom of the Christian gospel. In this way, too, Africa still calls.